Welcome to Moving the Needle, the podcast packed with digital marketing strategies crafted exclusively for med spas. If you're looking to draw in more patients, grow your revenue, and level up your business, you're in the right place. This show is your inside track to scaling smarter. Get ready to glow up and get your injection of med spa marketing strategies with your host, Chris Fink.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to Moving the Needle, the podcast where we talk about how to drive med spas and help them not just survive, but thrive in the world today. And I'm your host, Chris, and we have a really special episode for you today. One of the things that goes unspoken about in the marketing world is making sure that our clients, the med spa practices, are properly protected and taking the right steps towards compliance to make sure that they're set up for long-term success and they're not exposing themselves to any risks unnecessarily. So with that today, I was happening to scroll through some thread somewhere, and I saw a comment by my guest today, Christina Malik. And she specializes in compliance in the legal aspects of running healthcare, wellness, med spa, all of those types of practices. And so I reached out and I said, hey, would you be willing to talk? And she was so gracious as to give some of her time. So I'm really excited. Christina, do you want to just tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I want to thank you for having me on today. I'm excited to, talk about compliance, everyone's favorite topic, of course. So I'm Christina Malik, attorney and founder of Cor Consulting Partners, and I've spent 20 years working across compliance, finance, and operations in a variety of healthcare settings, including how to help med spas and aesthetic businesses scale without stepping into legal traps. So most recently, I was a COO of a fairly large med spa franchise concept with roughly about 60 locations as their COO and general counsel, and now I work with all types of med spas across the country. And I can say I've seen the great, I've seen the good, and I've seen the bad and the really, really bad, really dangerous. So I'm, here to make sure that people toe the line and do what they can do and make sure that they stay safe and compliant.
Yeah, that's great. And coming from a place of like real world experience, like this isn't theoretical or in a legal classroom, but you came across this stuff in the practices directly in your area of, accountability.
I did. Actually, even sitting as a COO, I would come across this. So not only have I seen it as an attorney and I've defended it, I've also seen it firsthand as an operating officer in some of the locations that I served in the formal role, but then also as a healthcare consultant serving in a fractional role. I've seen, the whole gamut, everything from a False Claims Whistleblower Act into just a traditional Office of Civil Rights investigation into malpractice cases. I've seen, the full run. So a lot of nuances to healthcare, and I think people see this industry as a fun and exciting and hot industry to be part of without realizing it still has that medical umbrella over it.
That's right. Yeah. And so today we're going to break down a few areas where med spa marketing operations and compliance can overlap or intersect, and how to avoid some landmines while scaling your practice. So let's jump into it. I think one of the first things, fundamentally, when somebody's considering opening a practice, the states in the US, there's all these different scenarios on who can own a med spa. So can you speak to that? Just like we can't do anything with something that you're not legally allowed to own based on your state. And it seems like that is a state regulated issue.
It is. And honestly, you hit it right on the head. That's the very first landmine that I see is ownership and licensing. So it's the very first thing that I look at typically when I'm partnering with a practice is your entity even set up correctly, right? So every single state is different, not only when it comes to who can own the practice, but then even as far as licensing is concerned, who can work within a scope of practice, even at the individual level. It varies so dramatically by state. And so I see a lot of owners say, I own a med spa in state A, I'm opening in state B, therefore it's the same. It is most definitely not the same. So you can't market a treatment that you're legally not allowed to perform. So for example, if your marketing says you offer PDO threads, but you only have estheticians on staff, that ad itself could actually be evidence of illegal practice believe it or not, that's where investigators are looking. They're looking at social media pages, which I know that we'll touch on in a little bit here. But
Yeah.
it's really important to make sure that what you're advertising and what you're marketing, you can legally do.
Yeah, because everything you put out there is a marketing ploy, but it's also evidence.
Sure
So,
is. And they will screenshot that and they'll have that right as a proof in an exhibit to show that you were in fact advertising something that you did not have the capability of doing.
now, if you were looking to opening a single location in any given state, or if you were considering opening multiple rooftops across state lines, what's the best strategy for making sure that you are set up, that you have the right ownership in place? And in some states, you can be an RN, some you can be a doctor, some you have to work in it, some you don't have to. Like, how would you guide somebody, or what resources would you give them to say, this is where you can get those answers?
So the first thing I would typically look at is whether or not that state enforces corporate practice of medicine laws. So almost every state has some version of a CPOM law in place. It's whether how enforced they are, right? So I see really three buckets. One, anyone can open a med spa. There's a handful of states in which it doesn't matter who it is. You can own it, I can own it. Anyone can open a med spa. The second is you have to be a provider of some type or have an appropriate medical license. That's really physicians or typically NPs. I don't see a lot of states where a physician assistant can. NPs tend to have a lot more autonomy, and so they can own a med spa. And then there's the other bucket in which it's only physician. So it's MD, DO, potentially doctor of chiropractic, but it's usually MD, DO. And those are the only individuals that can own a medical practice, and that practice can then, quote unquote, practice medicine. And in those states, you can still own a med spa, but you have to do it in a legally compliant way in which you partner with a physician who owns what I'll call the PLLC, which is the Professional Limited Liability Corporation. You'll partner with a physician, they'll own the PLLC, and then through a management services agreement, you will be able to contract with that entity to provide management services through a management services organization. So I won't necessarily get into the nuances of it, but in theory, right, you can own a med spa across all of the states as long as you're, doing it safely under the corporate practice of medicine laws.
Okay, that's great. And then when you get into things like oversight and protocols, like, so you've established now that you can open a spa and you're starting to kind of frame that in. Medical director responsibilities and protocols, like what are some real world examples of what proper oversight looks like for a med spa that can be applied, if we're thinking about building an SOP that can be applied anywhere?
So here's the other landmine, as you just pointed out, right, is I think people think I'm going to contract with this doctor. They're going to serve as my medical director and I've checked all the boxes. I'm good to go. I can do whatever I want from here. But there's a real case example of an individual. He was a PA, actually. It was in Illinois. He was a PA. He contracted with a physician to provide a medical director, service oversight. The medical director did what he was supposed to do. He was on site, he performed a variety of tasks, he helped train the staff, etc. But they actually didn't have the entity itself set up correctly with corporate practice of medicine laws. So they were just that individual PA, owned the entity, did not have the physician engage and actually formally set up a PLLC. And so then they got into issues not only with the entity not being set up correctly, but then pretty much everything else after that became subject to fines, et cetera. That individual obviously ended up with a fine and a lot of issues. You almost have to start back over. But that medical director is really piece one of the equation, is getting someone who actually believes in the business, who understands the business, who's licensed in plastics or dermatology, or is actually doing this type of work frequently. So one of the issues I've also seen is that it's just a physician of any kind. People think, well, I just have to have a doctor for oversight. It doesn't really matter. I'm the NP or I'm the PA and I'm going to be the one doing the work. And I don't really need this doctor to provide much to me. And that's a bad scenario to be in. You don't want to rent a doc, or a doc in the box is what I call it. You don't want someone to check the box, right? You want someone who's actually there on site, providing guidance and functioning within the contract. So you want to make sure, practices want to make sure that they have a medical director agreement in place, that agreement outlines the scope of services that medical director is going to provide, and then that they actually provide it. So having the agreement in place, but not actually providing the services can also open up a tricky situation and can land individuals in hot water. So I recommend, and every doctor's going to cringe if they hear this, they hate it. I know they hate it. I recommend timesheets. I think that there should be a monthly timesheet in which that physician shows exactly what they did for that medical director stipend. So whether they're getting paid $500, $3,000, $4,000 a month for their medical director services, it all needs to be fair market value for the work it is that they're doing. And the only way to prove that they've done that work is to actually have a record that they've done that work. Yes, nobody likes to fill out a timesheet. Nobody does, right? Every employee in the world hates it. But it is the only true way of showing proof that the medical director did what he was supposed to do within the contract. And honestly, every medical director stipend at every hospital system has an associated timesheet because it's a Stark Law requirement. So they're used to doing it. They give a little pushback, but they're used to doing it.
Yeah, so having a medical director that might serve as offsite, that's logging in and e-signing charts, or just, stopping in once in a while to sign charts, that's not really getting the job done anymore. Or maybe never was.
I would say no. I would say that the medical director needs to be involved enough in the business, understand the protocols, understand the services that are being rendered, and understand how to address any adverse events that come with it. So if they've never injected filler, they're not going to necessarily know what to actually respond with when a potential vein occlusion happens. So if they've never faced the adverse event themselves, they're not going to be as helpful as a physician who's actually been there, done it, seen it, had it happen to them. So I recommend someone who's done the work or who is actively doing the work, and someone who wants to partner with the business owner and wants to be present, not someone who's looking to collect a check, who's really just hands off and not wanting to be involved. And I use this line, you want your staff to be able to pick that doctor out of a lineup. If they've never met that doctor, if they've never met your medical director, and an investigator walks in and starts asking questions about the medical director and they don't even know what he looks like, not a good spot to be in. They need to have a collaborative relationship. They need to be able to reach out when there are issues. They need to feel comfortable enough with that medical director to reach out at any given point without being fearful or concerned or feel like they're interrupting the doctor.
Yeah. And then do you feel like it's important that the medical director has the opportunity to review and signs off on all SOPs and documentation for like how to perform? Because every practice should have an SOP book.
100%.
These are the things that you look at. This is, what you're allowed to do for numbing and, all these different things. And in the event of something like before trying to dissolve with Hyladex, check this. And, those things should be documented. Should the MD be the final sign off on that?
100%. So I think it can be a collaborative effort to create the SOP between the physician and who it is that they're delegating services to. But I think that ultimately they want to have a developed SOP, a protocol for each individual service it is that's performed at the spa that both the provider who's doing the service and the physician himself have signed off on. That protocol is going to go over everything from what the service even is to what the inclusion exclusion criteria for the service, any adverse event management, anything that would come from doing the service would be all included in this protocol itself, and they will have reviewed it ahead of time. I typically recommend that the doctor also oversee the provider doing it. And sometimes people like to inflate their skill set. So I recommend that the medical director who is, licensing and they're approving, they're delegating the service, right? I want them to make sure that they've actually seen it done. So I recommend 5 to 10, that they've overseen, each individual service that the spa is doing 5 to 10 times. So take a step back, most states are not full authority states where the NP or PA can operate independently. Almost every state is functioning in a manner in which the physician is actually delegating services down to the mid-level. So it's called a number of things: standard care agreement, delegation agreement, practice agreement, collaboration agreement, tons of names for it, but ultimately it's the delegation agreement that the physician is essentially delegating services down to the mid-level. That agreement itself covers a number of different things, but one of the largest is an exhibit should be attached that actually states what services that physician is delegating. And then that ties immediately into those protocols, into those SOPs that you mentioned. So yes, you are authorized to do neurotoxin. And then there's a neurotoxin SOP protocol that details all of the specifics of performing the neurotoxin.
Yeah, and then the providers will sign off that they acknowledge and they agree to adhere to those. And I mean, there's probably nobody I could say this to that wouldn't sing this louder, that, paperwork is the best legal defense. So having those LPs, but then that actually leads me into the next topic. Like, so from the SOP standpoint and having all of those things, your medical director, reviewing them, and at least if the medical director didn't write them, at least reviewing them, signing off and agreeing that yes, these are good, and then the providers acknowledging and agreeing to comply with those. And then how do you move into the next stage with all the marketing treatment documentation, the back end compliance? Like, how does that work in the general span of planning this all out?
You know what? You cut out there for a second, so I missed part of that. Sorry. I think my internet's giving me challenges.
No, that's okay. I'll go back. So thinking about the segue kind of from the SOPs and the providers agreeing, and then into the next step of documentation, which is consents and all the back end forms, the back end compliance issues. Where do you go next after you get all your SOPs and your providers and your MD on track? What's the next high priority thing that you would look at for consents and compliance docs?
Honestly, that's the biggest piece, right? So I think individuals are a little bit confused on what consent even means. So, the definition of informed consent. Think of yourself. If you've ever had Botox, have you gone in and I obsessed, a little overdue. So I've not actually ever had someone go through the full, true informed consent with me when I first started getting Botoxed. They handed it to me at the front desk. The individual who was a receptionist, she handed me the form and said, "Here's your consent for today." Sign. She scrolled through it and she said, "Sign at the bottom." And I did, because whatever, I was fine with it. I didn't really care. I'd researched it on my own. I think it was 26 or 27 at the time. I had my Botox, and on my way I went. But that's not actually informed consent. That practice kind of violated one of the critical steps in the process, which is ensuring that I'm informed of the procedure that I'm about to have. So the true definition of informed consent is the process in which a patient is given enough information to make a voluntary and educated decision about whether to proceed with a proposed treatment or not. And so that's the critical piece, is they have to have the education of what it is that they're getting done. And there are 5 core elements to the informed consent. So the first is disclosure. The provider themselves has to explain the nature of the treatment, the expected benefits, the risks, the possible side effects, alternatives, and then what happens if the patient does nothing. I think a lot of people think, well, this is all cash pay and it's at the patient's elective choice. You still have to go through the informed consent process. So the second piece of that is understanding. The patient actually needs to understand the information. So using plain language, avoiding medical jargon, ensuring that they comprehend it, asking if they can explain it back to you potentially. Those are things that I recommend that providers through the process are engaging in. Then the patient third is the patient has to have the mental capacity to make the decision. If not, then a legally authorized representative must consent for them. In this case, 99.9% of the time these patients are coming in, right? They have the mental capacity, but you still want to ensure that the patient meets that prong, because this is what's going to be used in litigation. If they don't, this is one of the prongs that's going to be looked at. And then voluntary. The decision has to be free of coercion, manipulation, or any undue pressure. And then finally, they have to clearly agree, right? They have to consent. That's the final step of the informed consent process, is they must agree, and then that's documented in a signed way. So in a signed consent form that is attached to the individual treatment itself.
So yeah, thinking about, like, a lot of the practices now have all digital intake and consents being emailed in advance, which does streamline the practice's efficiencies, right? If you have all those consents done, then you don't have $100 an hour, $70 an hour provider in there asking questions. Now you have them going in and doing treatments. So it's the best use of time, but it doesn't speak to the patient actually understanding, comprehending that. And how would you document comprehension in a way that could stand the test of time, so that 3 years later, if somebody came and raised a suit, that you could go back and prove that with your charts?
So I would still ask that every provider go back through that consent. Do you have to read it to the patient? No. But I would say you receive the consent via email. I see that you already signed it. I would love to just talk about the highlights of it, right? And you're going to talk about mostly the adverse events that could happen, right? What are the negative repercussions of doing this treatment? What are the potential risks of it? And you're really highlighting that and then confirming that the patient understands the risks and the benefit scenario. And then I would document, had a verbal conversation with patient about the informed consent. They understand the risks, the benefits, et cetera. So I would actually have that documented in a note stating that the provider in fact went over the informed consent, even if it was emailed ahead of time. Because believe me, in a malpractice case or in an investigation, they will pull the tech log to show when the informed consent was sent, when it was signed, and they will compare that to any notes from the visit, from the daily visit. So it's important to really still touch on the informed consent because it does take the provider explaining it to verify that the patient understood it. I've received documents that I haven't understood. That doesn't necessarily mean that just because I received them, I understood them. So we want to make sure that the patients truly understand what it is that they're consenting to.
So it sounds like then the best practice, you can use the digital intakes and send the consents and have them signed before getting there, but then prior to treatment, and these things would all be time stamped. So you would have the timestamp on when that was sent, when it was signed, and then when the patient arrives and they get checked in, then have a SOAP note that said, spoke to and reviewed. You have those in the SOAP notes, and then you begin treatment. And those records should stand the test of time and provide probably the best level of protection that you're going to get.
Absolutely. I also, though, there are a couple pitfalls even within that if you're doing that, right? And that's that people think that one consent is good for a year. It most usually is not, in fact. So if there's multi-series in a treatment, they need to sign the informed consent for each and every part of the series. And the consent needs to be updated when there is a new part of the treatment plan either being done or being added to the whole plan itself. So I think often what I see, or at least with my clients, they say, well, we have them sign a consent the first time they come in, and it's like a consent for Botox, for example. Right. But this patient is now having IPL, or they're having BBL or RF microneedling. They've never signed a consent for that service. They've signed a consent for Botox, their very first visit, and not again since. And so each time a patient is coming in for a service, they need to sign an informed consent. Even if they've had that service 900 times, they still need to sign an informed consent, indicating that they're aware of the risks and benefits.
That's one that I was not aware of. So I knew that you had to have a consent for each treatment type. So, coming in one time, Botox, gateway of aesthetics, right? So they come in and they get Botox, have them sign a consent form for Botox. And then if they come in a couple of months later and they're like, hey, I want to do my lips, great, filler consent. Now I want to do, BBL, great, BBL consent. But I did think, like for the Botox patients, most of the practices, well, I don't know about most. I guess I'd have to really ask more closely, but I think a lot of practices are kind of adopt that, like, yes, they did Botox, they signed the Botox consent. So if I'm only treating them for Botox, I don't have to get this for a year. And I do know of some practices that have at some point in their history operated under that mindset.
I agree. That's actually what I see the most frequently is individuals who say, yeah, I get it once and then I renew it every 365 days. I even have an expiration set up in my EMR that tells me when it is expiring. But right. Each and every time that Botox is injected, it's actually injected out of a different lot number, out of a different vial itself. So it's somewhat of a unique individual treatment every time. Now, Botox is tried and true, right? It's the same thing. There's not ever really a contamination, knock on wood, of that to worry about, but we want to make sure that that patient understands the individualistic risks that are carried with each and every time that they're having that service done.
Yeah, that's really good information. So, and then thinking about the kind of, that leads to my next topic, I guess, which is if you're getting your forms and your intake forms sent via SMS or email and your consent forms, what are some of the big pitfalls that a practice can run into with those patient communications? And at what, everybody's like HIPAA this, HIPAA that. No, HIPAA's only if it's insurance. No, HIPAA's not if it's insurance. There's a really big misunderstanding about when HIPAA applies and how it can impact patient communications, but then also having these communications through text messaging and emails and DMs?
100%. HIPAA, nobody likes to talk about HIPAA. It's not the most exciting topic. It's the one that probably carries the most risk potentially, right? The fines are massive. And it also becomes the most easily overlooked kind of component of this process because it's fun, it's an exciting industry, it's loose, it's much more casual than the stark white walls of the Cleveland Clinic where you know you're in a healthcare facility, right? Sometimes
Right.
the walls are pink and they're flowery or they've got great accents and it doesn't feel medical, but it is still in fact medical. So even though it's cash-based, HIPAA still applies. So it applies anytime that protected health information, whether that's names, treatments, appointment dates, zip code even. If it's one of the identifiers in HIPAA, then it's potentially at risk. So even if no insurance is billed, HIPAA is still a really big factor. And you know, it's not just about avoiding breaches, it's about how you're handling that information. So to your point, right, they're communicating with patients via SMS or a marketing letter, et cetera. All of that has the potential to cause a HIPAA breach or you know, potentially fines if there is a breach.
So how do they, what's the best way to safeguard that patient data in a way that like locks that opportunity away?
So I think the biggest thing is actually having it be top of mind, right? So it is a fun environment, it is an exciting environment, but it is still a medical environment. So having the providers understand that, even though it is, you know, med spa, that you're still required to comply with HIPAA. You can't go to the front desk and start talking about services that Mrs. Smith had in the room, right? You can't yell out to Mrs. Smith like, oh my gosh, it's great to see you. I'm so happy. How was your Botox the last time you were here? With 3 other people sitting in the waiting room, right? I think it becomes so loose that people start talking about their treatments at the front desk because it's fun and it's exciting to talk about them without realizing that the other individuals who are sitting in that room, potentially in the waiting room, you've now actually committed a HIPAA violation. So having it be top of mind, having it be something that's covered, whether it's in a bi-weekly or monthly staff meeting of just touching on, you know, any recent changes to any laws, any compliance generally, but then just bringing up, hey, let's make sure that we're being mindful of HIPAA. Let's make sure that we're not doing XYZ, right? We're not sharing information. We're not walking and complaining about a patient that we just saw either. We're not going from one injector to the other injector and saying, oh my God, this patient today was so terrible. And they're sharing information about that patient with another injector who does not have a patient relationship with that individual.
Right. So no treatment provided. Yeah. And, you know, I think about all the lobbies of the med spas that I've been in, and they are fun and they're exciting. And of course, everybody's like, you know, somebody comes walking out from getting even something just like a chemical peel or a hydrofacial, right? And they come walking on, they're like, oh my God, your skin looks so good. Do you just love your hydrofacial? Oh, you look so good.
Yep.
But if you're in a lobby full of people, then you're just volunteering information that that patient had a treatment at all, regardless of what the treatment is. You know, and it can be a laser, but it can also be a soft service that could be an esthetician service without necessarily needing, you know, an NP, but all of that still applies, does it not?
It does, right? So especially for practices too that have the patient sign that HIPAA compliance agreement at the beginning, you know, that entire quote unquote location, right? That entire entity then is subject to HIPAA. So having those conversations at the front desk, well, they are fun, right? Oh my God, your skin is glowing. It looks incredible. How was your treatment? And you start talking about the treatment, then opens that location up for risk. I've also seen this where practices are having events. So they're having really, you know, they're having parties and people are buying packages at the front desk and it's loud and they're yelling. So to speak, I mean, they're yelling over a lot of other folks talking about what it is you're buying. Oh, Mrs. Smith, that's great. I've got you down for a 3-pack of RF microneedling. Do you want to go ahead and add on, you know, 100 vial or 100 unit vial of Botox today? And they're yelling that, and there's 25 other people in earshot, and you know now that this woman is having these services done. So there's a lot of risk in that factor, asking zip code in front of everybody else, asking other kind of pertinent details. It all puts the practice potentially at risk, which, you know, creates some liability, and it's not insignificant in terms of fines and fees. And, you know, it can be pretty costly for the practice if they're not mindful of it. Now, one of the things that I highly recommend is when I start with a practice is, you know, we go through a compliance checklist, of course, but business associate agreements in particular, especially as it relates on the marketing side, because I think people think, well, I'm using an outside vendor, so it doesn't really matter. It's their responsibility. It is not, in fact. It is the practice's responsibility to safeguard their patient information. So every system that the practice uses, whether it's for EMR, for booking, texting, CRM, they all need to sign a business associate agreement and ensure that, you know, their information, their practice's information is going to be safeguarded by that other vendor, you know, through all capacities. So whether they're texting, whether they're using it for CRM, et cetera, that they are taking the appropriate safeguards to protect that patient information.
Yeah, and that actually raises a great point about, you know, a lot of providers and front desk staff, or, you know, just team members in a practice, they'll have access to the platform, maybe on their phone, on their laptop, their tablet. And if they take those devices home, if they're not a practice-owned asset that stays on site at all times, if that provider, if the reception or the front desk scheduling person can log in on their laptop at home, even if it's with the best intentions, just like, oh, so-and-so, Mrs. Jones called and she needs to reschedule, let me just take care of that real quick. But if you open up that patient data on your laptop in a library, somebody else can see that data. And if you leave that device unattended, then you've really just kind of left it like it can be the Wild West in that claim. So, I mean, how do you provide good customer service and patient service on those things, and responsiveness with DMs and people like trying, because patients now, they're after convenience. They are loving the 0-click functionality. They are loving the fact that they can search and book and be done, or they can shoot a message on a text. They don't have to call and go through the whole process. They just want quick and easy. And the practices are struggling to give it to them in a way that can be easy for the patient and capture that business, but not expose themselves to risk.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is one of the biggest pieces where I see people end up stumbling when it comes to HIPAA is the use of their own devices, the use of their own laptop to sign in, or their own cell phone to take before and afters. I've seen all of those things are big no-nos in HIPAA. You can't use your own devices. You can't take photos of somebody using a personal device and then later upload it to the EMR and think once because you've deleted it from your device, you're fine. So my recommendation is to really partner with platforms that understand HIPAA, that have HIPAA compliant software, that have HIPAA compliant storage software too. So not only their outbound interface is HIPAA compliant, but then where they're actually storing that, whether it's on the cloud or their own data warehouse, that all of that too is HIPAA compliant, and that they've got those business associate agreements in place and they know how those individuals are handling that PHI. So for your example, patients want what they want when they want it. They want it now. And
Right.
That's 100%, you know, reasonable. I get that as a patient. I want immediate gratification too. I want to be able to do my own thing and be able to text for responses. Just ensuring that it's on a HIPAA compliant texting platform, whether the EMR has that or whether that's a third party texting platform that you have to engage in, making sure that your choices for vendors are compliant with HIPAA is one of the biggest pieces. And if they give you pushback, which I recently had a client reach out and said that the vendor that they wanted to work with wouldn't sign a BAA. I'm like, biggest red flag, run away. Don't work with that vendor. They can tell you all day long they're HIPAA compliant. If they're unwilling to sign a BAA with you, they are probably not HIPAA compliant, and they are probably not going to safeguard your information. And guess who's on the hook when there's a problem? It's not them, it's you. It's you with the fines. It's you with the loss of business interruption. It's you that's either having to file an insurance claim based on it or alternatively having to come out of pocket for it. So make sure that the people you're selecting to be partners in your business with you, right, the vendors, which are a critical part of aesthetics, make sure that those folks also understand HIPAA and treat it the way that you would want that information treated. And as a patient, I respect that. If I know the practice I'm going to is HIPAA compliant, they're going to safeguard my information, and I don't have to worry about it landing on the dark net or the dark web, then I'm fine if it takes you an extra 30 minutes to respond to me if I know that my social security number is not going to be used to open American Express tomorrow.
Yeah, because it can happen. And that leads me kind of into, from the HIPAA side of things, which is protecting privacy and you're safeguarding your information, but then also for the before and afters are huge for a practice. They're so important, and social media is so important for med spas. I mean, that patients they might do a search and then find a potential practice that can provide the treatment that they want, and they might look at those things, but then they want to get some trust and like, see some evidence, right? See some reviews. So they're going to look at some reviews. They're going to look before and afters. They love seeing those things as patients. So how do you deal with that from the practice side to be able to provide that type of content to people looking for you, but again, also have social media compliance and the before and after consents? Like, how do you manage that?
You are so right. Before and after photos are marketing gold. Honestly, I look at them before I go to somebody new, or if I'm exploring a treatment, I want to see what are the actual results, right? Is it going to be worth my time, my money to do this? So they are incredibly important. They build credibility, they convert consultations, and they can generate patient interest. But they're also one of the most common compliance failures too. So when they're done correctly, they can be your most powerful marketing tool. When done incorrectly, they can lead to privacy complaints, board investigation, and broken patient trust. So here's kind of the biggest tip, is that any photo tied to a treatment is also protected health information under HIPAA. So even if you crop out the face, the patients could still be identified by tattoos, scars, or other features. I actually had a coworker in my last role. I would be able to tell her entire head could be removed from an image, and I would still be able to tell her based on a very specific labyrinth tattoo that she had. So just because someone puts the black bar across the eyes, or they take off certain features, or they blur certain features, doesn't mean that they wouldn't necessarily be identifiable to someone else, especially like a family member. So if someone could connect the dots, that patient is protected health information, which requires a consent. And consent is where most practices end up falling short. So treatment consent is not the same as photo consent. I think people get kind of confused the two, that if they signed a consent, that's great. They signed a treatment consent, but they need to also sign a social media release or a social consent. That's typically a different form altogether. So a separate release that clearly outlines how the image will be used, whether that's on social media, a website gallery, print ads, in-office displays, and then they need to have the option. So maybe they're not okay with it being on the website, but they are okay with it being on Instagram. And then they also need to be told and explained how they can revoke consent. And that ability to revoke that consent needs to be able to happen at any point. So Botox treatment consent not automatically give you the permission to post their Botox results online. Very different approval process.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Which ties directly into marketing, right? So without those signed releases, the marketing department's teams their hands are kind of tied. So when photo consent is built into the intake workflow, so you've got your treatment consent for your Botox, separately you can have that social media or that social consent release form, then it can just be part of the process naturally. It eliminates any obstacles and then ensures that marketing can showcase those real results and shows them safely. It becomes very critical, especially when adding like new services, threads, injectables, high energy devices, that the consents themselves for treatment are of course updated, but then also that photo release is updated to specifically cover those treatments as well.
Yeah, and again, paperwork's your best friend, right? In the legal sense. So, and I know that I've seen some practices that will include the photo consent. But I think I want your opinion on this because I think it could be dicey or risky, is they'll bury it in the intake form and it'll be in the intake and it'll say like, and then it'll be default checked and it'll say like, I agree that all of these, you can take my picture and do whatever you want with it and use it wherever you want, but they don't sign a separate line for that item acknowledging, like it's not even a checkbox with a sub signature, like initial here, initial here, initial here, and then sign. It's all part of one big form. And it might not be the treatment consent, but it would be the intake, and it will be buried in there. I think that's risky. I think it needs to be called out a little more specifically.
Agree entirely. Having it as just being, especially an automatically checked box, no automatically checked boxes of any kind. I would recommend that the patient themselves either have to check it, or alternatively, mostly preferred is to actually have to initial that individual line. Frankly, I would prefer a completely separate sheet of paper altogether that's not just buried into an intake form. And by the time you get to the 5th page of an intake form, it's like, just, I don't care what you do. Just let me sign on the bottom, fill it out however you want. It's kind of my vibe, which is terrible. But that's where you get to, because you're just so inundated with so much paper when you're going somewhere new for the first time. But it's so important, which takes me back to that informed consent process. So the person who's going over the paperwork with them needs to also say, and this is our social media policy, this is how the image is going to be used. And that patient needs to individually select if they're okay with it being social media, with a website, with training, with education. There are some things patients are comfortable allowing their photo to be used for, but not necessarily comfortable for it to be out on maybe the internet, right? You can use it for education, but not on your website.
Yeah. And actually, I love how this conversation is like taking me right to like my next thought, which thinking about the website and the socials and promotions, and advertising really at that point, like things like claims, raffles, giveaways, promos, things like that, announcing the winners, gift cards, all of that stuff, FTC claims. Like, how do you really focus and zoom in on what's legally risky and versus just bad marketing?
Great question. Great question. I see this come up quite a bit too, because people want to be able to give away free stuff. Well, if you come here, we'll give you free Botox, or you can get free filler raffle, right? So there was a spa who actually ran a free filler raffle. It violated anti-inducement laws. And then of course, fines followed from there. There was another spa who advertised PDO threads as scar-free and permanent. Well, usually they're scar-free externally, not always, but usually. And they're definitely not permanent, right? So there's some potential violations there in just the way that it was being advertised. So what happens? Patient complains, right? Regulators find out, guess where they go? They go right to that social media post. They see what was said, and now all of a sudden you've got a deceptive practice or truth in advertising. You take a picture of a bodybuilder and post that saying, hey, come get M-Sculpt Neo, you'll have these amazing abs. Well, that person didn't have M-Sculpt Neo, and therefore you've now just violated FTC rules and what it is that truth in advertising laws, right? So there's a bunch of kind of nuanced marketing rules that come in when you're using photos back to the before and afters, whether you're pulling in freebies or trying to induce people to come in. So avoiding words like guaranteed, permanent, or miracle, having a legal review, of course, for any promos and influencers. That's a big thing that people are using right now. They're using influencers, but a lot of the times, most states require that you actually put that as an asterisk, that this individual has been paid, or it's a sponsored post, or this person has earned something based on providing this review or this recommendation. So there's some variances in the laws, but there's federal and state rules that come into play where it's illegal to offer patients any item or service that or should know is likely to influence them to receive services from a particular provider. That those typically apply to programs that bill Medicare or Medicaid or even commercial payers. So some of the spas that do therapeutic indications that bill insurance, it's especially applicable to them. But there are some states that also have their own anti-kickback and anti-inducement statutes that apply to cash services, specifically for med spas. Those laws prohibit giving away or raffling any medical services such as free talks or free filler, or share this post and enter to win this. That can be seen as influencing patients to choose your location over another location.
Wow. So that sounds like that's a pretty sketchy world to be like. We've seen them for decades, and still see them. I still see them regularly, like people having these offers out there. And that type of information is, I think, really valuable. So that right there, like everything that you've brought so far, Christina, is gold. And it's so helpful and valuable, I think. With all of these things that we've talked about and all these different elements, what you mentioned this a couple of times, like getting somebody a complaint triggers an audit. Like, what does trigger an audit or a review, and what are the steps that a practice, if they did get targeted for an audit or review, what are the immediate things that they should do to protect themselves?
So at this point, everyone's probably a little scared of like, well, I'm definitely going to get audited because I've done one of these things, right? Who hasn't? But audits are one of those things that every med spa owner just needs to be prepared for, not to necessarily be stressed over. So I don't want to downplay the importance of making sure that people are compliant with the law, but it's going to happen. It's not a matter of if, it's when. It will happen for sure. So, and they come from many forms. So there's regulatory, there's clinical, there's operational, financial, and every one of them could potentially look at different aspects of the business. what they all have in common is that they expose weaknesses. So if the practice isn't ready, even a small gap can lead to pretty big consequences. So regulatory audits specifically are coming from places like the medical board or nursing board or the health department. They often honestly start with a patient complaint or a competitor's report. So I hear that from a lot of clients that, well, the person down the street actually filed a report and it was their competitor who said, hey, such and such is doing this, or they have someone practicing outside their scope of practice, which then triggers an audit. And honestly, I don't want to say that the auditors go on fishing expeditions, but I feel like they're going to find something, right? Once an audit begins, they look at everything: protocols, training records, supervision, scope of practice, and your marketing. So if you're promoting services that your staff aren't licensed to provide, or if your protocols don't actually have the details behind them, or they're in a binder that none of your staff even know exists, those can all be proof of non-compliance. And then there are HIPAA audits, which of course we talked about, that really focuses on how you protect patient information. So not even just about charts, it's about the communication systems and the marketing practices. Are your texts and emails being sent securely? Did you post a before and after and the person didn't give you consent for doing so and they reported you for that, right? And now all of a sudden you've got an Office of Civil Rights investigation and they're looking at everything. I'm working with a practice right now that the exposure risk, to be honest, is probably about $2 to $2.5 million because of a HIPAA violation that they ended up having, right? So it can be a significant financial penalty for not having appropriate safeguards in place. And sometimes it's, as simple as just making sure that people are familiar with it, that they've gone through training and education on it. And of course, we didn't touch on this, but OSHA. So ensuring that the staff and patient are trained safely, that if there's in the unlikely, hopefully, event of a needle stick injury, et cetera, that's handled appropriately and that it's following all of the OSHA recommendations and guidance when it comes to chemical exposure, PPE, or bloodborne pathogen training. So while OSHA doesn't necessarily touch into the marketing piece, careless social media posts about showing unsafe practice can absolutely lead to an OSHA audit.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up because I wasn't even thinking about that. I'm aware of it. And like, having your medical waste, having your exposures, your BVPs, like all of those documents in place for your staff and how to deal with an incident. And yeah, that's a great point. Well, I think, Christina, we're coming up on our time, but it sounds to me like there's a lot of things. There are some new things in here, like more often than not, I think these practices know a lot of this, but they just need to be reminded. It need to be taught less than they need to be reminded. But there are some new things here that I think are really worth paying attention to, and some misconceptions that you've cleared up and dispelled. So thank you so much for doing that. If anybody that's watching or listening to this wants to reach out to you and engage your services for a full compliance audit and to make sure that their practice is set up for the best possible legal standpoints and protection and compliance, what's the best way for them to reach out to you or find you?
So I think the best way is probably my website. It's COR, C-O-R, which stands for Compliance Operations and Regulations. So COR, consultingpartners.com, or alternatively via email, Christina@corconsultingpartners.com. I've got a great checklist that individuals can use to really do an audit of their practice, see where they are, see what's missing, perhaps even things we didn't go into today. There's a whole host of compliance concerns that could rear up and really be costly for a practice. So I consider myself to be that connective tissue between legal, operations, and compliance and finance, and where it all intersects. So I try to help business owners in a inexpensive way to make sure that they protect their own practice, because what I'm interested in is protecting the industry as a whole. And if we can have every individual practice protect themselves, then we protect this industry, this unregulated wild west industry. Let's all do our part. And so I've created a variety of toolkits for my clients to help keep them safe. And honestly, I'd rather be someone's first call than their last call. So instead of self-diagnosing on ChatGPT, let's reach out and let's get some feedback on what we should be doing to make sure that when someone with a badge walks in, that you are protected and safe and that you don't have any risks that are or exposure concerns.
Yeah, amazing. Well, yeah, that's great. So I'll make sure to have that information also in the show notes. So if anybody's watching this, go ahead and just scroll down a little bit and I'll have Christina's information. You can reach out to Christina for a direct audit. If you're looking for a solution for some compliant, minded marketing, then of course you can reach out to me, and I'm happy to have these discussions with you as well. And it might be a conversation where all three of us jump on a call. So with that, Christina, again, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule and sharing all of this information with us and with all of our listeners. We really appreciate you.
I very much appreciate the invitation, and I really looking forward to continued dialogue and conversation. So thank you very much for having me. It was my pleasure.
Well, let's keep moving the needle, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next time.